I am Michael Turner, 42 years old, a senior risk analyst in Denver, a man whose entire professional life revolves around identifying volatility before it detonates. And yet on that October evening, at exactly 8:17 p.m., while I was reviewing quarterly exposure reports under the soft blue glow of dual monitors in my home office, I failed to anticipate the single most destabilizing event of my adult life, which was my wife, Lauren Mitchell, standing rigid in the doorway with her arms folded, and delivering a 30-day ultimatum as if she were presenting corrective action steps to an underperforming employee rather than speaking to the man she had shared a bed with for 11 years. There was no preface, no attempt at emotional transition, no softening language to suggest this was a difficult conversation she had struggled to initiate. Instead, she announced, in a tone I had heard her use when negotiating vendor contracts, that I had exactly 30 days to become the husband she deserved, that I needed to be more intentional, more present, to make her feel chosen. And she did so with the cadence of someone reciting prepared bullet points rather than expressing heartbreak, which immediately told me this was rehearsed. I remember the clock on my screen because it felt absurdly precise. 8:17 p.m., a timestamp burned in my memory like the moment a market crashes, and as she spoke, I waited for specifics, for a concrete grievance I could respond to, for a story about something I had done or failed to do. But she provided none, only abstract metrics that sounded like they had been pulled from a self-help podcast, rather than from lived experience within our marriage. Be more intentional, she said, but when I asked what that meant in practical terms, she shook her head slightly, as if I was already demonstrating the deficiency she was diagnosing, as though the act of requesting clarity was itself proof of emotional incompetence. And that was the moment the dynamic shifted in my mind from crisis to strategy. I have spent 2 decades assessing language for hidden risk, parsing ambiguous clauses in contracts, identifying when a statement is deliberately structured to create leverage, and her words were not an invitation to repair, but a positioning maneuver, a reframing of our relationship into a hierarchy where she evaluated and I complied. We had argued before, of course, about schedules, about my late nights during audit season, about her feeling overwhelmed when her own workload intensified, but never once had separation been mentioned. Never once had she suggested she was contemplating life without me. And yet here she was imposing a deadline like an executive terminating a partnership unless performance indicators improved. The absence of examples disturbed me more than any accusation could have, because without specifics there is nothing to address, nothing to fix, only a perpetual state of inadequacy where the target remains undefined and therefore unreachable. And I realized that if I accepted the premise of her ultimatum, I would be consenting to operate inside a system where she alone determined success or failure. She did not cry. She did not waver. She did not even sit down, which felt symbolic in hindsight, as if remaining physically elevated in the doorway reinforced the authority she was asserting, and I noticed how carefully she avoided any admission of her own contributions to whatever dissatisfaction she was feeling. In that moment, I felt less like a husband and more like a subordinate awaiting a performance improvement plan, and something in me hardened not out of anger, but out of recognition, because power moves disguised as emotional appeals are still power moves. And once you see them, you cannot unsee them. I understood that night that this was not about romance, nor about rediscovering connection, but about establishing dominance through ambiguity. And the 30-day countdown she imposed was not a path toward intimacy, but a test designed to ensure I would bend. And I knew with unsettling clarity that whatever happened next would define not just our marriage, but the balance of authority within it. Over the previous 6 months, long before the 8:17 p.m. ultimatum crystallized into something undeniable, I had begun cataloging small irregularities in Lauren's behavior the way I would flag anomalies in a risk assessment report, subtle deviations that on their own could be dismissed as coincidence, but together formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Beginning with the introduction of new passwords on devices we had always accessed freely, passwords she framed as healthy privacy and personal boundaries, yet implemented abruptly after a decade of open familiarity. Her phone, which once lay face up on the kitchen counter without ceremony, began lighting up with notifications that she instinctively angled away from me, tilting the screen with a fluid, almost unconscious motion that spoke of repetition, and when I caught the glow reflected faintly in her glasses, she would swipe them away before I could register the sender's name, offering casual explanations about group chats or work threads without ever elaborating. There were also the Pilates classes that suddenly shifted from late afternoon to evening slots that overlapped with dinner, stretching from an hour to nearly 2.5, and when I pointed out the logistical conflict, she smiled with a rehearsed calm and said she needed something that was just for her, that self-care should not require negotiation, and I agreed in principle because I have never been opposed to independence. Yet the timing felt less like self-development and more like strategic absence. Her social media presence evolved in parallel, and I noticed a tonal change that felt performative rather than playful. Posts where she joked publicly about being married to a robot who loves spreadsheets more than romance. Captions accompanied by filtered photos and laughing emojis that framed me as emotionally mechanical, which might have been harmless banter, if not for the accumulating undercurrent of narrative shaping, as though she were slowly preparing an audience to view her as underappreciated. The amplification of that narrative often came from her friend Chloe Grant, whose comments were consistently loaded with phrases like "know your worth," "demand better," "stop settling," language that positioned Lauren as someone tolerating deficiency rather than participating in a partnership. And while I have nothing against supportive friendships, the tone felt less like encouragement and more like escalation. When I attempted to have a grounded conversation about what exactly she wanted to change, to move beyond abstractions and into specifics, she responded with bullet points that contradicted themselves in a way that no measurable improvement could ever satisfy, telling me she wanted more spontaneity, yet criticizing me for disrupting her schedule when I suggested last-minute plans, insisting she desired greater structure while simultaneously accusing me of being too predictable, asking for emotional depth while dismissing practical gestures as transactional. Each request was shaped in a way that rendered success impossible because the criteria shifted depending on context. And, as someone trained to evaluate risk, I understood immediately that this was not a collaborative effort to refine our marriage, but a construction of perpetual imbalance, where I would always be slightly behind, slightly insufficient, always chasing a moving target. The more I analyzed her words, the more apparent it became that clarity was intentionally withheld, because clarity creates accountability, and accountability would require mutual examination, whereas ambiguity grants unilateral authority to judge without being judged. I did not confront her with accusations, nor did I escalate the situation into something dramatic. But internally, I began to accept that the issue was not lack of effort on my part, but the cultivation of leverage on hers. And by the time she delivered the 30-day deadline, it felt less like a sudden crisis and more like the final phase of a strategy that had been quietly unfolding for months. Instead of arguing that night, instead of rising to the emotional frame she had constructed and defending myself inside criteria she refused to define, I did what I have always done when confronted with instability, which is conduct a methodical audit, beginning not with her words but with my own infrastructure, because if someone places a deadline on your value, it becomes less about feelings and more about exposure. After she went to bed, I remained in my office with the house unnaturally quiet, the hum of my desktop the only consistent sound, and I began mapping out every financial intersection between us with the same clinical detachment I apply to portfolio risk assessments, opening spreadsheets not for work, but for my life, listing joint accounts, shared credit cards, automatic transfers, subscriptions tied to my email, streaming services, utilities, insurance policies, any channel through which my $186,000 annual income flowed into shared access. I was not acting out of panic. My pulse was steady, my breathing even, but there was a clarity to my thinking that felt almost sharpened by betrayal, because I understood that leverage in a relationship often reveals itself first through resources, and I needed to know exactly how exposed I was if the 30-day performance review turned into a termination notice. I logged into our primary joint checking account and reviewed the last 12 months of activity, noting how much of my direct deposit was allocated there versus into my individual savings, calculating percentages in my head with reflexive ease, observing how intertwined our financial systems had become over a decade of marriage that had once felt stable and reciprocal. From there, I examined subscriptions tied to my credentials, professional memberships, software licenses, home security access, making quiet adjustments where necessary, updating passwords not out of secrecy, but out of prudence, understanding that digital access can become a weapon when trust fractures. At midnight, I updated my emergency contact information through my employer's portal, replacing Lauren's name with my older brother Jason Turner, a small administrative change that carried disproportionate emotional weight, because it marked the first formal acknowledgement that I could no longer assume she would act in my best interest if circumstances deteriorated. The next morning, during a break between meetings, I accessed the county records for the deed on our house in Aurora Ridge, reviewing the ownership structure, confirming how the title was registered, analyzing what division would realistically look like in a worst-case scenario, not because I intended to escalate, but because ignorance is the most expensive form of optimism. Over the following days, I researched short-term furnished apartments downtown, places within walking distance of my office, where leases were flexible and utilities included, reading reviews late at night while Lauren scrolled on her phone beside me, unaware that I was not trying to escape, but preparing for optionality. Every step I took was deliberate and quiet. Not reactive, but strategic, because I have seen enough collapses in both markets and human behavior to recognize the pattern of someone positioning themselves for either control or discard, and I refused to spend 30 days attempting to meet undefined standards while leaving myself structurally vulnerable. I was not waiting to see whether she intended to reshape me or remove me. I was ensuring that whichever path she chose, I would not be the only one unprepared. The following week, Lauren intensified the performance narrative with a precision that felt almost theatrical, as though she had decided that if she was going to evaluate me, she would also curate the stage on which the evaluation occurred. And it began with a steady stream of text messages during my workday, containing links to relationship articles about men who orchestrated elaborate surprises, men who rented rooftops for candlelit dinners, who recreated first dates with painstaking attention to detail, who transformed ordinary Tuesdays into cinematic declarations of devotion. And each link arrived without commentary beyond a single line like "This is what effort looks like," as if forwarding hyperlinks constituted emotional transparency. I read them between meetings with the same analytical detachment I apply to industry reports, noting how conveniently the narrative centered on spectacle rather than substance, on grand gestures rather than consistency. And when I responded by asking whether there was a specific experience she felt we were missing, she replied with a thumbs-up emoji and no elaboration, which reinforced the pattern of suggestion without clarity. Midweek, she informed me, not consulted me, that she had booked a couple's retreat in Aspen costing $2,400, presenting it as an investment in us, and emphasizing that the early bird discount would expire within 48 hours, the tone less like a mutual plan and more like a limited-time offer on a malfunctioning appliance. And when I pointed out that my schedule required advanced coordination, she countered by saying that if I truly prioritized the marriage, I would make it work, framing logistical reality as emotional deficiency. The escalation did not stop at digital prompts or financial commitments. She began inviting her friends over more frequently, particularly Chloe, and during those evenings, she would recount stories about how I needed to step up, about how she had set expectations, and was waiting to see who I would choose to be, telling these anecdotes with a performative sigh, while subtly observing my reaction for signs of jealousy or insecurity, as though my composure itself was data she could interpret. I noticed that she curated these conversations carefully, selecting moments when I was within earshot but not directly included, ensuring that I absorbed the narrative without being granted the space to counter it, and the social dynamic felt less like communal support and more like reputational positioning. One evening, she left her phone face up on the kitchen counter, an unusual reversal of her recent habit of angling it away, and a notification preview illuminated the screen from an unknown contact whose name I did not recognize. The message reading, "Are you getting any response to the deadline yet?" And she did not rush to flip the phone over, which made the visibility feel intentional rather than accidental. When I finally addressed it, not with accusation, but with measured calm, asking whether there was someone else involved in this sudden urgency, she did not deny it directly. She did not reassure me or express indignation at the implication. She simply said that's not the point. And in risk analysis language, that is the equivalent of refusing to confirm or deny material exposure, while insisting the discussion move elsewhere. Her deflection was more telling than any confession could have been, because innocence tends to clarify while strategy redirects. And in that brief exchange, I understood that the 30-day ultimatum was no longer just a marital critique, but part of a broader recalibration of options, in which I was being evaluated against alternatives I was not allowed to see. One Thursday at 11:52 p.m., with the house dark and the low rhythmic cadence of Lauren's breathing drifting down the hallway from our bedroom, I logged into our bank portal and transferred exactly half of our $48,000 joint savings into a separate account I had opened years earlier and never used, an account that had originally been intended as a long-term contingency fund, but now felt less theoretical and more necessary. And I moved $24,000 with steady hands, not as an act of hostility, but as a recalibration of symmetry, because shared resources require shared trust, and I no longer had empirical evidence of the latter. The transaction confirmation appeared on my screen with clinical neutrality, a simple timestamp and reference number, and I stared at it for a moment, not with guilt, but with recognition that this was the first irreversible action I had taken since the 8:17 p.m. ultimatum, a shift from preparation to execution. And the absence of emotional turbulence inside me confirmed that this was not impulsive but deliberate. Immediately after, I removed her as an authorized user from my primary credit card, navigating through the issuer's account management settings with the same detached focus I use when adjusting risk exposure in client portfolios. And I did so quietly, understanding that access granted in trust can become liability in uncertainty. I then changed passwords on utilities and streaming services connected to my name, updating login credentials for electricity, internet, water, and the various subscriptions that had gradually accumulated over the years, not out of spite, but out of clarity, because infrastructure should not remain open when the foundation is being questioned. From there, I retrieved our small fireproof document safe from the hallway closet and carefully photographed every important document inside: my passport, my birth certificate, my social security card, the car title, the deed copies, insurance policies, scanning them into encrypted storage on my phone and laptop, ensuring that even if access to the physical originals became complicated, I retained verifiable proof of ownership and identity. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional shifting of air through the vents. And in that stillness, I packed a medium black roller suitcase that had once been used for business conferences and anniversary trips, placing inside 2 tailored suits, 3 pressed dress shirts, a pair of gym shorts, running shoes, basic toiletries, and the gray quarter zip she always mocked as too corporate and too predictable, a garment she had once teased me about wearing, like a uniform of emotional monotony. And as I folded it, I felt an unexpected steadiness, because that quarter zip represented continuity of self rather than conformity. I did not slam drawers, did not create noise, did not rehearse speeches in my head. Every movement was measured and quiet, almost ceremonial, as if I were acknowledging internally that clarity requires action, and that boundaries, when drawn without rage, are not revenge, but maintenance. By the time I zipped the suitcase closed, it was 12:37 a.m., and I stood for a moment in my office looking around at the familiar furniture, the framed degrees on the wall, the carefully arranged shelves, recognizing that preparation does not guarantee departure, but it does eliminate dependency, and I felt a calm that was deeper than anger, the calm of someone who understands that control regained through quiet structure is more durable than control asserted through argument. The following morning the house felt unusually still, the kind of silence that exists just before a storm breaks, and I was already dressed in a navy suit with a white shirt buttoned to the collar when Lauren walked into the hallway and noticed the medium black roller suitcase positioned neatly beside the front door, its handle extended as if it had been waiting there long before she chose to see it. She looked at me with narrowed eyes and asked why I was dressed for work so early, her tone carrying a mixture of suspicion and irritation rather than curiosity, and I told her calmly that I was stepping out of the review process she had created, that I had signed a lease for a 1-bedroom apartment in downtown Denver effective immediately at $2,150 a month, and that I would not remain in a dynamic where my worth was measured against undefined metrics with a countdown clock attached. I explained that if she genuinely wanted counseling or a structured conversation about the future of our marriage, we could discuss it without deadlines, without spectators, without social media narratives or implied competition, but that I would not live inside a 30-day evaluation designed to test my compliance rather than cultivate mutual accountability. She blinked as if recalibrating her expectations, and for a brief moment the composure she had maintained over the previous weeks fractured into something closer to disbelief. Then she accused me of being dramatic and hostile, of overreacting to what she framed as a wake-up call, and the irony of that phrasing was not lost on me, because nothing about my preparation had been impulsive or theatrical. She then asked if there was someone else, the question delivered with a sharpness that suggested she had already constructed a narrative in which my refusal to submit must be fueled by outside influence, and I answered without hesitation that yes, there was someone else, but not in the way she imagined. I told her there was a man I had not been in years, a version of myself who did not accept ultimatums as currency for affection, who did not operate inside shifting goalposts or compete for his own dignity, a man who required a life structured around clarity rather than coercion. And as I said it, I felt no anger, no surge of adrenaline, only an alignment between words and conviction that had been building quietly since the moment she stood in my doorway at 8:17 p.m. She opened her mouth as if to argue, perhaps to renegotiate the frame she had established, but I did not raise my voice, did not escalate, did not list grievances or recount the previous weeks of escalation, because the decision had already been executed in action long before it was verbalized. I picked up the suitcase, felt the weight of it settle into my hand, and walked toward the door with the same steady pace I use when leaving for any ordinary workday, aware that the power in that moment did not come from dominance or defiance, but from the refusal to participate in a system designed to diminish me. And when the door closed behind me, it did so without a slam, only the quiet click of finality that accompanies a boundary drawn without rage. In the weeks that followed my departure, the emotional posture Lauren had maintained began to erode in subtle but unmistakable ways, and the shift revealed itself not through dramatic apologies, but through incremental tonal changes in her messages, where the confident authority that once framed me as under review gave way to something closer to uncertainty, and I could sense it in the way she texted that I seemed distant, as if distance had not been the explicit result of the structure she imposed. At first, her outreach carried a veneer of casual concern, comments about how her friends were worried about us, how Chloe had asked whether everything was okay, how people had noticed I was not around, as though external observation might compel me back into a dynamic I had consciously exited. And when I responded politely but briefly, she escalated into nostalgia, referencing vacations we had taken, inside jokes from our early years, memories curated to evoke sentiment rather than address substance. When nostalgia failed to provoke the reaction she expected, guilt followed, framed in statements about how she never imagined I would walk away so quickly, how she had only wanted us to grow, how she felt abandoned in the very process she claimed was meant to strengthen us. And the inversion of responsibility was almost methodical, suggesting that my refusal to participate in her evaluation equated to emotional withdrawal. Eventually, the tone hardened into frustration, and she reminded me that I still had weeks left on her original 30-day deadline, as if the countdown remained binding despite my explicit withdrawal from the premise itself. And that was the only time I responded with a statement that carried definitive finality, telling her that the deadline expired the moment it was spoken, because any metric of worth that begins with an ultimatum forfeits its legitimacy at inception. After that exchange, she requested a meeting at a cafe in Cherry Creek, selecting a neutral public space that felt deliberate in its optics. And when I arrived, she was already seated near the window, posture composed, but eyes scanning my face for cues, as if assessing whether absence had softened me. She said she had only been trying to motivate me, that the ultimatum had been intended as a catalyst rather than a condemnation, and the phrasing struck me as another reframing attempt, transforming a power move into constructive guidance. And I listened without interruption, because composure communicates more than argument. When it was my turn to speak, I told her calmly that marriage is not a probation period, that partnership does not operate on performance improvement plans, and that respect cannot be conditional on passing monthly evaluations administered unilaterally, because once respect becomes transactional, it ceases to be respect at all. I explained that motivation built on threat breeds compliance, not connection, and that I was no longer willing to confuse the two. And, as I spoke, I felt no hostility, only clarity, the kind that emerges when boundaries are enforced consistently rather than negotiated reactively. She watched me carefully, perhaps expecting anger or pleading or regret, but what I offered instead was steadiness, because the absence of pursuit had already shifted the balance of power, and I understood that what unsettled her was not my departure, but my refusal to compete for approval that should never have required competition in the first place. By early December, the practical elements of my transition were no longer provisional, but permanent, and what had begun as precaution solidified in a structure as I extended the lease on my downtown apartment without hesitation, converting what was initially framed as temporary distance into defined autonomy. In the act of signing that extension carried none of the emotional turbulence people associate with separation, only a measured acknowledgement that stability does not require proximity to dysfunction. I set up a new P.O. box a few blocks from my office, redirecting bank statements, legal correspondence, and professional mail to an address unconnected to the house in Aurora Ridge, understanding that privacy is not secrecy, but containment, and that separation requires logistical precision if it is to remain calm rather than chaotic. Shortly after, I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney whose office overlooked the Denver skyline, and the conversation was clinical, focused on assets, timelines, documentation, and statutory frameworks rather than accusations or narratives, which suited me because by then I had no interest in storytelling, only in resolution. And I filed for legal separation, quietly, without public declarations, without social media statements, without informing mutual friends, allowing the paperwork to move through official channels rather than emotional ones. Through mutual acquaintances, the information reached me regardless, as it inevitably does, that Lauren had begun seeing someone from her fitness studio, a man described as charismatic and spontaneous, someone who fit neatly into the archetype she had been circulating in her articles and conversations. Yet the same reports carried a secondary detail that she had expressed frustration about his lack of stability and ambition, remarks delivered in tones of disappointment that echoed complaints she once leveled at me in reverse. The irony registered, but did not provoke reaction, because by that point her choices had ceased to function as validation or rejection of my worth, and what once might have stung now landed as neutral data, information without emotional leverage. What mattered most had already shifted internally. In the quiet recalibration that occurred the morning I walked out without raising my voice, when I realized that identity anchored in self-respect does not require external confirmation, and that the most consequential decision I made was not transferring funds or leasing apartments or filing paperwork, but refusing to negotiate my value inside a framework designed to diminish it. She had given me 30 days to prove I was worthy of being her husband, framing love as something contingent upon meeting evolving criteria. But by the next morning, I had proven something far more fundamental, which was that my worth was not a variable to be tested under deadline, and that needing to compete for dignity inside my own marriage was itself evidence that the structure had already collapsed.